Right now, I want to welcome from the Washington Examiner, Mr. Mark Tapscott to the program. Mark, thanks for your time today.
How you doing today?
I am very good, and I was fascinated by your piece about journalists grappling with fear and doubts about firearms after the attack on Charlie Hebdo in Paris. This was quite the discussion, it seems, started by a university professor who's a member of investigators, reporters, and editors. And I was really intrigued by this, Mark, because it sounded like there was such a lot of response from all across the spectrum from journalists who were talking about whether or not they wanted to own a gun, whether or not they wanted to see their workplace more secure.
Yeah. It was quite an interesting reaction, and a number of the folks who responded to my question on that particular listserv on LinkedIn were actually from the BBC, some from France, some from Canada. They were from a lot of places around the world, and their reactions were very much as you might expect. I think most journalists are probably vigorous advocates for stronger gun laws and don't necessarily want to have anything to do with guns. And this issue of the Paris attack and the prospect of something like that happening here has perhaps, hopefully, given them reason to seriously re-examine that.
Well, you know, it seems like some people maybe were, others weren't, but I was struck by one a guy that you quoted, I think a columnist or a researcher for Forbes and The Economist who talked about, he would like to have a handgun to be able to defend himself.
Of course.
But he said, he thought that this probably maybe bolstered your pre-existing attitudes. If you were anti-gun before, maybe this makes you even more anti-gun. We need to ban guns, Mark, so that bad guys can't come into our workplace.
Well, yeah, that works about as well as the gun-free zones around the schools.
Yeah,
it just doesn't work, and that's one of the significant outcomes, perhaps, of the Paris attack, is that it really is going to force people like journalists to use common sense rather than ideological or the kind of herd mentality approach to things that sometimes we encounter among our fellow journalists. They're going to have to face the reality that if somebody is pointing an AK-47 at you, do you want to have a keyboard to throw at them, or do you want a 45 to fire back at them? At least you'll have a chance with the 45.
And yet, Mark, there was a BBC journalist who was absolutely horrified.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That this was even being discussed here. Well,
I think there are degrees of recognition that it's time to think things through a little bit differently. That particular reaction, I thought, was frankly what I expected to encounter from a lot more folks that responded to it. There's just an awful lot of folks in the journalism profession that they've never been around firearms, number one. They didn't grow up with them, and they just don't know a whole lot about them. So they are very much dependent upon cliches and stereotypes in their thinking about them, and that frankly is a problem that could get them killed.
Well, I guess this is the big question here. I certainly don't think we're ever going to see a day and age where every journalist is pro-gun or personally or even institutionally. But it seems to me that we do have a number of journalists, Mark, who are really downplaying the threat, not just to freedom of expression, but again to those, investigators, reporters, and editors. This was an organization I actually belonged to, or I used to belong to it when I was an investigative reporter.
Right.
And, one of the founders, as you point out in your story, one of the founders of this group actually died in a car bombing.
That's true, Don Bowles.
So this goes beyond the issue of, Islamic jihadists.
Yep.
And it really does go to the heart of, if you are doing really powerful investigative journalism, you may find people that want to hurt you, that want to stop you from getting these stories out there. And I think for a long time, Mark, there's been this sort of attitude among a lot of journalists that this is an easy job. This is a fun job. It doesn't come with any risks. We get to take down the powerful. We get to do all of these things. We get to come up with listicles. But it's not necessarily a dangerous job.
Well, it's not that dangerous, at least to this point. It's not that dangerous until you are assigned to something overseas. A very good friend of mine who was our managing editor here for many years was actually in Afghanistan in the early stages of the U.S. intervention there, and was riding in the car just ahead of a car that was had 4 journalists, and the Taliban stopped the car and murdered all 4 of the journalists. That really brought home to him the importance of being defended and being able to defend yourself. And, the Committee to Protect Journalists has documented, I think it's some 67 examples of journalists around the world who have been mostly, in most of the cases, frankly, assassinated.
Yeah, and again, I think that we're certainly that's not going to change for the. I think it seems highly unlikely that it's going to change for the better.
I'm not so sure.
Really?
Sure. No, I really do think that this is one of those moments where reality intrudes, and an awful lot of folks, I hope and I think, in newsrooms in America are going to, not necessarily anywhere and not necessarily everywhere, but I think an awful lot of folks, frankly, are being brought to their senses by the prospect of having to think about these things. Eric Holder said Sunday that he was referring to Paris. He said, we can expect something like that in America. And if Eric Holder says that, my gosh, it must be true.
Yeah, and so again, we get back to the mindset, Mark. I mean, if you have the top law enforcement official in the United States saying, look, it is likely that something like this is going to happen here in the United States, is it are we just burying our heads in the sand here if the response among journalists is, meh, it's not something I'm really worried about, it's not something that I have to worry about?
Well, that is burying your head in the sand, and so is the attitude that you may have noticed a couple of the folks who were responding expressed or alluded to, and that's the idea that, well, that's the responsibility of the owners, and if they can't protect us, we're not going to do anything to protect ourselves. That's a very dangerous attitude, frankly.
Absolutely, it is. And compare that attitude to one that you end your piece with. Daryl Todd, the owner of the Pulaski County, Arkansas Daily News, said, quote, those of us who value the First Amendment need to remember that the Second Amendment is also in the Constitution. If a reporter wants to own a weapon, it's his or her own business and nobody else's. I think, Mark, that a lot of maybe the Beltway media, a lot of the Times Square media could learn a thing or two from the owner of the Daily News there in Pulaski County, Arkansas.
Well, I'm from Oklahoma, but, in spite of the fact he's from Arkansas, well, I will certainly agree with you because what he said was exactly on point. The First Amendment protects the freedom of the press, and the Second Amendment ensures the freedom of the press, and the Second Amendment protects it. And it's not coincidental that the one follows the other.
Absolutely. Well, listen, as somebody who grew up in Oklahoma myself, maybe this guy just, got that common sense blowing on the wind, because it does carry eastward from Oklahoma into Arkansas.
Right. All the time.
All right, listen, Mark, I appreciate you coming on the program. And I'm curious, before we let you go personally, I mean, is this something that you and your colleagues at the Examiner have discussed since the attacks?
Oh, yeah, we've been talking about it. And, our newsroom is probably pretty representative. And we've had some, shall we say, spirited discussions.
Now, is the Examiner newsroom, is that located in D.C. itself?
We are at 15th and K. We are 2 blocks down the street from the Washington Post, which you may have noticed over the weekend published one of the Charlie Hebdo Mohammed cartoons. Mm-hmm. Act of great courage in my view, but, may have put them on a target list.
Well, they have, and again, certainly operating in our nation's capital, those of you who are employees, those of you who are members of the media who would want to have a firearm for personal protection, D.C. doesn't want you to.
We can't do it. I know it. And I live in Maryland, which is almost as bad. So I'm thinking seriously of moving to Virginia.
Let me know, Mark. I'll be happy to help you out any way I can. I'll help pack for you because we'd love to see you get to freedom. Mark, listen, I appreciate your time, sir. Thanks for what you're doing, and look forward to doing this again very soon.
All righty.
Mark Tapscott joined us from the Washington Examiner.